Welcome to Explore, Explain, Highlights. In this Highlights package, we'll be looking at Season 5, Episode 3, with our guest, Natalie Erdem, discussing their project, MSNBC Election Big Board.
You know, everyone was switching to browser-based, right? Because it was more streamlined. There were a lot of things that were easier about doing that, right? Once you did the lift of building it out, right? So I think it really was EJ's vision, like those conversations happened before we came in to the project, but I really think it was his vision to say, like, hey, let's take this into the browser and let's create, something that is easy for the talent to use. We can modify easily, we can update, we can have, the data filtered in. So it was really his vision. But the interesting part about it was that made it not necessarily just a broadcast project, right? Then now it's a digital project. So the digital team and the broadcast team are very siloed.
Right.
So at that time they were anyways. So that was quite interesting to kind of bring those two teams together. Like, I remember our first meeting, there was like 25 people in it. So there were all these people from the digital team, right, that are used to working in a digital way, right? So, okay, we want to do something. Let's create a ticket. It'll get done in this sprint.
But yeah.
The broadcast team is like, so we're going to need that tomorrow morning for air. So we need you to fix it. And the digital team's like, that you can't fix that by tomorrow morning, So they worked in very different ways. It was very complicated to navigate that. And I think you need to have very strong project management in order to succeed in that type of environment, which we did have. We had for MSNBC, there was this guy, Michael Small, who was the project manager. And then I was working for our team. And we worked very closely together, and we had to be very goal oriented because we had such a short timeline. So that was difficult to navigate because we had several layers that we were working with and quite a few unknowns, right? So we were very excited to do a touch screen, but we'd done big data displays, but we never done a big data display that had one user and millions of viewers and it's being videotaped, so we were like, out of our element for sure. But I do think the reason that it worked and the reason that we do consider it one of our most successful, one of our biggest known and very successful projects, is because what we bring to the table is an expertise that they didn't necessarily have in-house.
Right. I was wondering about the kind of potential designy conflicts that could happen there.
Well, they had done, so sometimes we would come up with a design and then they'd say, yeah, we did that in, 2016. Yeah, we did that in whatever year. Because a lot of people had been there for a long time and working on elections for a long time.
Yeah.
And that really worked as an asset for us, right? Because it made the app the best it could be, right? Because we would try things that maybe had already been done, but then we would try things that hadn't been done and they'd be excited about that. And then that question was, well, does that resonate with the audience? Like, will they be able to understand it through a screen at this granularity, with this color contrast? So all those questions came up like along the way, right? But we ultimately, it was interesting in that you're working for a corporation, really, right? So there is that top-down,
hierarchy
aspect where hierarchy, where the president of NBC can say, I hate that, get rid of it, and then all the work you did gets tossed out, right? But for the most part, they loved what we did. We worked so well together and we had a really, really positive experience. And luckily for MSNBC, they have Steve Kornacki, and he's a huge differentiator, right? Because he's this kind of, I remember, I think it was 2018, but it might've been the next election. This woman from SNL, she did all these tweets about him, and she's like, this is who I want my election information from. And, you know, he kind of became like a national treasure, right? And he's just honestly like such a nice guy. And he's so knowledgeable, and he really cares, and he knows all the history of the elections in the US, and he knows what stories he wants to tell. So I think working with somebody that really has a passion for this and really is invested and knows what kind of stories they want to tell is such a benefit to creating something that is interesting for the audience. You know?
So was the notion of competitiveness with other news media and a desire to be distinct, a desire to emulate, to not what they do and to do a bit more what they do, was that part of the conversation, you know, kind of early on in this process about perhaps not just a motivating factor, but something that you're trying to sort of lead towards as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, they're all competing, right? So that's a fact. And because of what had happened in the Gore-Bush election, where the news networks had to go before Congress and all of that, there have been regulations put in place, right? So all the networks receive the same data. It's pooled together, like they pay for it together. And I didn't know any of this when we started, and I found this fascinating. And then each network has a decision desk, right? And so the decision desk is isolated, and they're not supposed to watch the other networks and see when they call elections, right? So if it's like Arizona and you know, they're gonna, you know, Fox might call it, right, based on the percentage of votes that have come in. So MSNBC might not call it, right? So the decision desk makes that decision, and there's a team of people in there, and they run their models on the data, but they all receive the same data.
I see.
So so polling data, I think I'm not sure about polling data if they use the same polling data or not. That can be a little bit more varied, I think, but I do think they might go in on that together as well. So because of that, because they're isolated, so we did get to go into the decision desk area when it wasn't election night and test out the app in there and have them looking at it and see what, you know, see what they do in there. And it was just really cool and really interesting to understand the election process and how these networks work. But yeah, as far as the design process goes, and like before we got to using the app on air and before election night, for sure they're watching what everybody else is doing, you know, and they, not the decision desk, but like the network itself. And they want something that's going to differentiate them. And as far as like, we built a lot of different visualizations that I think Herman showed some of them at the Outlier conference that got thrown out, right? Because we were having fun and we were like, oh, this will be cool. This will be interesting, you know? And then it's like, okay, well, what does the audience actually need to know, right? So it's pretty simple what they need to know at a base level, like what we would call like the most common user journeys. For the more edge cases, that was more of what if this happens, right? What if this happens on election night? What if there's a runoff? What if there, you know, we did build in the feature for outstanding vote, right? So that Steve could present, okay, this is how much of the vote we're waiting on, right? So there were a lot of features like that and a lot of indicators to the users at home that they could even see that if he wasn't even talking about that necessarily, right? So yeah, I think the biggest thing that we changed frequently and that was a bit, you know, a bit stressful was where he would touch and where he would access things, right? So so, you know, originally we had, for example, like I'll just use one example. In the title bar, we had that as a drop down, right? So he could access historical data that way. So they used that for a while, but then I don't even remember the reason, but they wanted that change. So so there was a lot of that testing and figuring out what, you know, he could where he could remember to find which things, because you have to realize like this guy is doing this in 30 seconds, you know? So a lot of the hits other than election night are 30 seconds, 60 seconds. Even the ones on election night are too. But he's on TV for a lot longer. So there were a lot of those things back and forth. But I would say for that, you know, none of us knew, you know, it was all new to everybody as far
Absolutely
as that
right.
went.
And
you know, we were driven to tell more complex stories with different visuals because that's fun and exciting for us. And we think that's cool. And we think that's interesting. And we think people should be able to understand it. And they really would understand it if they could use it themselves, right? I think that disconnect of like, this is on a screen and one person is actually guiding the user through it. Steve certainly could do that. I just think that the higher ups had they're very risk averse, right? They don't want to do anything to like rock the boat, you know, and they don't want to lose viewers. So if you start showing a new visual and it's unfamiliar, the viewer does have to learn it, right? So as database people, we're used to seeing every type of chart under the sun and we just automatically know what it's saying, right? But that's a really key important thing for us as practitioners to always check ourselves about, right? Especially
100%.
if we don't have access to the end user for some reason, right? If we don't have access to them, it's really important to have other people weigh in or to get other stakeholder feedback on that, or people that have knowledge or have done it before, because that is something that I find in our industry. You know, we want to push the envelope. We want to try new cool stuff, right? Which is awesome. And we should keep doing that, but it might not necessarily work for
well, that's right.
He was in charge of election designs for stills and had worked on the election designs for years and years and years. So he was a huge benefit to have because he knew all of that information and he really gave us a lot of guidance with like, this will work, this won't work, you know, we'll have to change this, these things won't go together. So it definitely was a huge diversion from how we're normally used to dealing with color. And it was challenging, you know, because if they didn't look right through the screen, then we had to make modifications and that might affect other aspects of the design. One thing that we did that was really kind of, I didn't love it at first, was we put a highlight around so it would run around the congressional districts so that the user could see it. And I was thinking that doesn't look very good, you know, like on the computer, but they could see it on TV. So, you know, I think, and it ended up working pretty well. So that was an aspect that I wasn't anticipating we would have to do a lot of work on, you know. At that point I was thinking, oh, this app is pretty much ready to go, you know. But there were modifications that had to be made based on that testing. And, you know, of course we handled that fine. I just didn't see it coming, you know.
Thank you for joining us for this Explore Explain highlights episode. As always, the full episode is available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. We hope to see you again soon on another episode of Explore Explain.